right there, Latin 3. Here we go. The final countdown. Who talks like that? Okay, so 62 Big C, Pompey's camp. And again, who wrote this? So of course he's going to have this in here. It really sets apart this idea of Caesar and Pompey as poor man, rich man, which is I mean, you go back to Rome and that's a big thing. And actually it kind of tugs at Roman heartstrings because they forever see themselves as a poor farming community. No matter how rich an empire they become, their values are still entrenched in that kind of mythos, which, by the way, is the same as the American mythos, because the slave owners who started this country, they absolutely were crazy about the Romans, a slave republic. So in Pompey's camp, it was possible to see tree arbors set up, and that's like they brought in potted trees and bent them together so that there would be shade. A great weight of silver had been laid out, silverware. Tents were paved with fresh sod. They brought in fresh dirt to go around all the tents. Even the tents of Lucius Lentulus and several others were covered with ivy. So he's, throwing some shade at this guy. Like, hey, by the way, remember that rich prick, Lucius Lentulus? He had his tent covered with ivy. Like they had soldiers whose job it was to do those things. And furthermore, many things that indicated excessive self-indulgence and confidence in victory. So that it could easily be thought that those who were seeking out unnecessary comforts had no fears regarding the outcome of that day. But these guys were throwing the charge of, or were throwing the idea of self-indulgence at the very wretched and long-suffering army of Caesar, which had always lacked every necessity. Not every luxury, every necessity. So here's what he's doing. He's saying, look at these rich people. Look at all the stuff they did. Look at the detail that they put into having a comfortable camp. They didn't think they were going to lose it all. They thought they were in no danger. First off, suckers. Second off, they kept saying that Caesar's men were overconfident. They kept saying that Caesar's men were self-indulgent because Caesar wanted to be recognized by his rightful. So he's basically taking all the charges against him and lumping them in with these effete snobs that just got their butts handed to them by Caesar's men by looking at their camp and saying, see, this is those kinds of values. This is not too different than a speech that Pat Buchanan gave in 1992 called the Culture War speech. If you are missing out on some very well-written hate speech, feel free to go look it up. But essentially, he casted things as ordinary Americans versus the elite. And it was kind of a recasting in 92. And it's held, unfortunately, ever since. So, anyway, Pompey, since our men were now situated inside his stockade, he had obtained a horse. And he had torn away the insignia of command and threw himself out of the camp through the main gate, spurring on his horse, and immediately galloped to Larissa. So Pompey basically was dressed as a slave escaping on a horse. And the soldiers would be like, hey, he's a slave, who cares? Pompey escaped like a coward. He went out like a little punk. He did not stop there, but he picked up a few of his men in retreat, and with the same speed and haste, and since they traveled through the night without stopping, with a company of 30 cavalrymen, so remember, cavalrymen aren't really Romans, he reached the sea and he boarded a grain ship. Not even like his great battleship, no, a grain ship. Complaining frequently, as it was said, that he had been so terribly mistaken that, and here's a very important sentence, so I'm going to come back to it in just a second. But, so I want you to see the picture that Caesar's painting. This very, very rich man has now been brought so low that he's pretending to be a slave. He's riding around with foreigners. He's fleeing desperately to the point where he doesn't sleep at night. Desperately, and then he gets on a grain ship. That's how low he's been brought. Okay? And that he had been so terribly mistaken that he seemed almost to have been betrayed by that same class of men, the cavalry, from whom he had hoped for victory, and by whom, once the beginning of the fight took place, he had been betrayed. So in other words, I'd hoped that they would secure me victory, and they're the ones that brought about my defeat. He's complaining while going aboard a grain skiff. And then he's going to end up in Egypt. And then he ends up in Egypt and gets his head cut off and his finger cut off by people who knew him, because the king of Egypt ordered it to be done. The boy king of Egypt, like a 14-year-old boy. And Caesar was pissed. So, anyway, that is the end of the Battle of Pharsalus. How dreadful for Pompey. And this is what happens when you're not around to write your own histories. Somebody else is going to do it for you. Okay, I'm going to hit the button.